how are you feeling post 2 rounds with Sam Harris?
That was extraordinary. And the problem is, last time I grumbled about it, he insisted I did a second podcast. So the risk is, if I grumble about it a third time, I'm going to be on for a third podcast. I felt it was interesting to do 2 rounds of what felt to me like 90 minutes, but I'm sure 90 minutes each, so probably 3 hours. Though I'm sure Sam's supporters will tell me that I've exaggerated that, and it was nothing like that amount of time at all. I mean, Sam Harris, as I'm sure almost all your listeners will know, is an American neuroscientist, philosopher, and very prominent atheist. And I just did 2 episodes of his podcast where Sam Harris was trying to get in, particularly in the second session, into his view that Islam is a uniquely, I think, dangerous religion, and that it felt like he seemed to be saying, a kind of existential threat to British society, and this was the big danger lurking in plain sight, and I wasn't really acknowledging how much of a threat this posed to Britain, and I was trying to defend it. The main point that I wish I'd emphasize more, though, when we talk about podcasts discussing this kind of thing, and I mentioned it, but I didn't lean into it hard enough, is that neither Sam nor I are Muslims. Neither of us read the Quran in Arabic. Neither of us are actually fully up to speed with Islamic theology. And it's therefore a bit weird, I felt, for us to spend quite so much time with me defending Islam and him questioning Islam from that point of view. But actually, I'd be interested to hear what you thought. Did you catch up on those podcasts? That's what
I did. I listened to them both. Viewers might have seen that. Well, you have one conversation where you speak a little bit about, I think you're talking about the war in Afghanistan, and Sam asks something about whether failure there was inevitable because of the influence of religious thinking. And it's only afterwards you made a comment to Hamza Yusuf on a separate podcast saying that he wouldn't let it go.
Yeah.
And I know you later said you regretted that and apologized to Sam, but it was clear that there was a disagreement there. But it was only on that second one that you really cashed it out. And the interesting thing for me was that, given that you were talking originally in the context of the war in Afghanistan, you have Sam Harris on one side who has some study of theology. I mean, I don't know how deep it goes, but he certainly spent a lot of time thinking about religion, thinking about Islam as a religion, thinking about theology, the philosophy behind the religion. As far as I know, he's never been to Afghanistan. And then Rory Stewart, on the other hand, who I don't know if you have any interest or training in theology, but you certainly have the travel under your belt in a way that Sam doesn't. And the thing that I found interesting was trying to work out whose expertise was more relevant to that conversation. And I wonder what you think of that. Like, what do you think is more relevant to discussing the question of the influence and potential threat that some people are saying that Islam or Islamism poses to the UK? Do you think it's more helpful to know about the theology of Islam or to have traveled to the Muslim world?
Well, I think that, I mean, let's take this question of what kind of threat Muslims pose to the United Kingdom. I think it's really important to be immersed in the British context to answer that. I mean, I think the answers to these questions are not theoretical. They're very local and particular. And I think, it's not so much that Sam hasn't spent much time in Afghanistan. I just don't think he understands Britain as well as I do. And, I'm British. I worked in British politics for a long time, and being a politician is a strange thing. I mean, you do, for better or worse, spend a lot of time knocking on doors, engaging with people, receiving emails, going on television, being challenged, being questioned. And my sense is that the really defining aspects of Britain, the problems we face, are poverty, European Union, our inability to build infrastructure, sort out planning, care for the elderly, housing. And the question of a few, or I don't even get into a few, the question of radical Islam is very, very far down on the list of my sense of what the major problems facing Britain are. And the only reason I get to that is I'm interested in your view on this, Alex, that I think that each of us, in different ways, particularly kind of intellectuals, get bees in our bonnets about one particular thing. And we decide that that particular thing is an existential crisis that defines our entire civilization. So for Sam, you get a sense that that is Islam. For me, it might be I convinced myself that Boris Johnson was an existential threat to Britain or a particular vision of hard Brexit. For J.K. Rowling, it could be transgender is the thing that defines it. If you're a particular type of Anglo-Catholic priest, it could be women bishops could be the thing, right? If you're somebody who is involved in universities, it could be free speech in universities is the number one thing. And each of us takes this one thing, and interestingly, in each case, it's a different one thing, and imagines that this is the defining issue of our age, and that every sign of decay and problem is driven by this one thing. And when, of course, we try to talk about it, we can come across slightly as a crank, because nobody else has invested quite as much emotional and intellectual energy into this issue as we have. So, I feel this slightly. Somebody tries to talk to me about Boris Johnson. They quite quickly are like, oh, what's going on? This guy's obsessed with Boris Johnson. Why does he keep telling me how evil Boris Johnson is, right? This is mad. And I feel the same, if you watch, I'll finish on this, but you feel, when I listen to J.K. Rowling talking about her fear of transgender people going to bathrooms, I'm like, whoa, why is she talking so much about it? Why is this so important to her? I mean, it's almost as though with all these things, it's not really the question of whether someone agrees or disagrees. People might actually have no views on these things at all and just be completely mystified by why this dominates your life.
I think there are maybe two reasons that can happen. One would be ideology. If I'm speaking broadly here, if you are a traditional feminist, you might start to see everything through the lens of patriarchy. If you're a socialist, you might start to see everything through the lens of class. Everything becomes about it. I think that does tend to happen. But another is so-called lived experience. That is, I'm sure that something isn't going to seem like an immediate threat and an emergency to you if it's not something that you're personally involved with. I imagine that Sam probably on a daily, if not hourly basis, gets emails and messages that are worrying enough that if they weren't so regular, he would send to the police on a regular basis. Now, it's difficult to know what that's exactly like, and it's certainly difficult to know what that does to someone's psychology, but it's maybe difficult to say that it's irrational to have that experience and not think that this is a unique problem, if not the only unique problem.
And also, it's so difficult to empathize and have compassion for people who are going through that lived experience, while also working out how one puts it in proportion.
Of course. Well, that's the key here, isn't it?
And that's so difficult, right? So, as an MP, I would receive a lot of abusive messages. My female colleagues receive even more abusive messages. Female colleagues who are Black receive even more abusive messages. The question, though, for all of us is how we view that. Do we see these things as representing some enormous problem in our society? Or do we say, a few cranks are sending me messages, and actually most of these people who are threatening me are probably not going to do anything about it? It's a difficult thing to process.
Sam wanted to ask you about the case of Mike Freer, who listeners may be aware, recently announced that he was standing down from Parliament because of the threats that he'd received. Also, you were speaking recently on an episode of The Rest is Politics about the Lindsay Hoyle saga, breaking parliamentary convention, causing huge scandal. And it seems, at least, because there were concerns that had MPs voted on this motion, they would have been put in danger, or at least been open to these kinds of threats that we're talking about. Now, I'm sure that these threats come from all over the place, but I suppose what I'm asking is, can you understand someone who is a critic of Islam, like Sam Harris, experiencing that? Do you think it's irrational to see that as something that's really important to talk about?
Irrational is a really freighted word, and particularly with someone like Sam who puts a lot of emphasis on reason.
Yeah,
I think it would be very dangerous to accuse him of being irrational.
Sure.
But it's so important setting context and getting things in proportion.
Yeah.
And not, for example, I mean, look, what's at the heart of the debates around Islam at the moment? Why is it so raw in Britain at the moment? Largely because of the Hamas attack on Israel, the Israeli response in Gaza, and marches in the streets. Right? So let's take the marches in the streets. Is it irrational for people to feel that those marches are anti-Semitic or not? I don't know. I mean, I was talking to Ed Kessler, who's a Jewish scholar of interfaith dialogue, and he observed that he had Jewish friends who went on those marches and said, I saw no signs of anti-Semitism at all, and other Jewish friends who saw the same marches and said, I experienced it as an anti-Semitic threat. And I think what he was trying to point to there is that this really isn't about a sort of an objective quantification or a debate about, one example he'd give, he'd say, Ed would say the placard, Palestine will be free from the river to the sea. He would say there's nothing anti-Semitic about it. But if somebody drives right through the middle of a Jewish neighborhood, waving the flag, honking a horn, screaming at people out a window, then maybe the sign does become anti-Semitic. So I think part of the problem here is that we're not really dealing, and this is where the irrational-rational question comes in, really dealing with something that's sort of objectively quantifiable. We're dealing with tonal things.
The full conversation with Rory Stewart is available via the link on your screen. If you want to get early access to episodes and get them ad-free, then support the channel at patreon.com/AlexOC. If you liked that episode, subscribe. If you didn't, subscribe anyway. See you in the next one.